Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.27, and in this lesson I'm going to be going through our last parameter here on our one oscillator, and that's the oscillator sync. Now, I was really struggling as whether or not I should show you this now, because traditionally, and in pretty much every time I've encountered it, oscillator sync requires two oscillators for it to work. And I'm going to define what oscillator sync is. I'm going to show it to you in another synthesizer, and then we'll take a listen to it here in the Polysynth. So let's start by defining what oscillator sync is. Oscillator sync is a feature in synthesizers, so that's incredibly helpful. One oscillator will restart the period of another oscillator. Okay, so when we say period, we should be thinking about phase and where that phase is going to start, so that they will have the same base frequency. Okay, so this is not a pitch change. This is a timbre change. It's going to change our harmonic relationship, but it's not necessarily going to change the pitch. The timbre can be altered on the synced oscillator by varying its frequency input. Okay, very important. So we know when we change the frequency that normally what we're doing is we're changing the pitch. Now, in the case of oscillator sync, as we try to change the pitch, it's going to force the period of that waveform to adhere to the master. Okay, and so the master is a synced, so a synced oscillator that resets the other oscillators, that's the master, like I was trying to say. And any synced oscillator that is reset by another oscillator is called a slave. And there are two basic forms, hard and soft, and you're normally going to encounter hard. I really can't imagine you encountering soft sync, or if you do, feel free to send me a message and I'll try to explain it. But in Bitwig, we have a hard sync emulation, and what I want to do first is show you what oscillator sync is all about, and then we'll listen to how it works inside of Bitwig Studio. So typically with oscillator sync, and let's just go ahead and copy this span over. In this particular synthesizer, our default frequency is going to come from here. It's going to come from the sub. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pull down my other two oscillators in here, and I'm just going to come up with something. Let's come up with a pitch. Okay, so when it's all the way down, it seems to be playing a D, even though I am pressing the C note on my keyboard. This is going to be very important in a second. So the sub is our master. Okay, now I can turn oscillator sync on independently on my two different oscillators here, and you can see that it's by default turned on to oscillator 1. The cool thing about oscillator sync is that we don't actually need to have our master playing at all. So I'm going to turn off oscillator 3, and I'm going to turn on oscillator 1. And actually, I wonder if I can put this in the center if it's going to play a C. Let me just check this real quick. Come on, buddy. Okay, so we are playing a C with our sub. That's the only oscillator. Oh, that's turned on, I believe. Perfect. Okay, so how oscillator sync is going to work. As I start to change the pitch of oscillator 1, as I start to change the frequency, its period is going to be forced to restart and change so that it will stick to this master here of a C, of C3. So let's go ahead and listen to this. I'm going to turn oscillator 3 off, and I'm going to turn oscillator 1 on. In a sync relationship, you don't need to have the master on. Okay, so right now it should just be playing a C3. But as we start to change the semitone and this fine tone, we're going to start to hear some oscillator sync in action. So notice our C3 is still staying here, but we're getting all these different hyped harmonics. So that's Oscillator Sync in a nutshell. It was so hard for me to set that up and explain it. I had the program crash on me like 6 times, so I'm not going to go back and edit this video. But that's what Oscillator Sync is, and that's the timbre that's evoked from Oscillator Sync. Now, inside of our Polysynth, we can do the exact same thing, only all we have to do is turn the sync knob. So right now I'm playing a C3. And as I pull this sync up, we're going to start to have a very similar effect that we just heard inside of that tall electro. Now I can pull down pretty low. Let's hear what we get if we're going to start playing some bass notes. And so the adjective that's always used when you talk about oscillator sync is it sounds like it's tearing something. And that's where like the tearing leads, the famous leads from the analog synthesizer, often came from using oscillator sync. It would be on something like a saw wave, for example. And then here we go. It can really help something cut through the mix, and it's just a lot of fun to play with. So now we have all sorts of different options available to us in this one oscillator. We can change the shape. We can add in another oscillator, a sub-oscillator. We can adjust the pulse width on either of those. We can add in some extra voices, and we can turn retrigger on or off. So let's go ahead and make something interesting here. It's way too low. So that right there is just the oscillator. We're not using any filter. We're not making any changes to our amplitude envelope. This is all happening with just one oscillator inside of the Polysynth. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.